Escaped Sapiens.
Why do men die younger? Why is there no male oral contraceptive? Why do men commit suicide more often? Are sperm counts and male fertility really dropping? How many men are taking supplements, injections, and undergoing surgery to build muscle, regrow hair, and augment their bodies to achieve idealized forms of masculine perfection? In a research landscape where there are countless brilliant initiatives, conferences, and journals dedicated to female reproductive health, what is the male analogue of gynecology? In this episode of the podcast, I speak with Rene Almeling, who is a professor of sociology at Yale University. We discuss the gaps that exist in medical research, the social conception of gender that led to this point, and the implications of this lack of knowledge, not only on men, but also on their partners and children. I hope you enjoy. Rene, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I've been interested in men's health for some time, from mental health and suicide rates to the lower life expectancy that men face to body issues such as steroid use. And I guess recently there have been reports that there's dropping sperm counts and infertility issues. And, these are all big topics, big important things, but in our public discourse, we don't really talk about these issues so much. And the thing that really caught my attention with your work is you're focusing on sort of the attention to these issues in research. And so let me first start by just asking you, to what extent is there a gap that exists in male health research generally, and I suppose reproductive health specifically? I know it's a big question, but...
Yeah, well, it's okay for you to ask me a big question because I just spent about 6 years writing a book trying to answer that exact question. So I have been doing research. I'm a sociologist at Yale, and I've been doing research on gender in medicine for about 20 years now. So I started graduate school in 2001. So this is my 20-year anniversary of beginning some of these projects. And the thing that has really sort of captured my attention for the last 6 or 7 years is, noticing in this field of reproductive health just how much, research, how many professional medical associations, how many conferences, textbooks, you name it, are really devoted to women's reproductive health. And I think that intuitively makes sense to a lot of people. But it does, once you start thinking about, well, it's not just, one person who reproduces. It's, often two people, and, there's other combinations. We could get into that. But, that often men are involved in some way, to some extent, in reproduction. And yet there is very little knowledge of how men's own bodily health matters for reproduction. In the world of infertility, there's relatively little attention to male infertility. You could look at contraception. There's more than a dozen different kinds of contraception that women can use, and yet men have only 2 options, which are condoms and vasectomy. Those are the same 2 options they've had for the past century. So, no matter kind of where you look at in the world of reproductive health, there's really much more focus, attention, knowledge making around women's bodies than there are around men's. And I came to be interested in the why, how did we get here? And so I ended up kind of diving into this history of medicine rabbit hole and finding myself in the late 19th century and, thinking about medical specialization. So, there's a lot of sort of ways that I could answer the question of how did we get here, but that would be a longer answer. But yeah, I think that it is absolutely correct to say that there has been inattention to men's reproductive health. And I think that has all kinds of ramifications for healthcare and public policy and biological knowledge about bodies.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'm kind of curious about is, so when you're researching this, how do you tease apart when something's hasn't been done because it's difficult as opposed to people aren't interested? So for example, you mentioned, the male pill, for example, like an oral contraceptive. Like, is that a situation where it's just harder to make, or is it a situation where socially we don't think of that as a viable option? How do you tease this apart?
It's a good question. And I will say that it's very rarely the case in sociology or history that it's just one answer. So I think, rather than saying, oh, is it one or the other? Most of the time I find myself using ands instead of ors, right? And so I think both that the male contraceptive pill is sort of more difficult socially and conceptually to think about, in part because we've so long associated women's bodies with reproduction and contraception. And it's the case that people have been working on a male contraceptive pill since the 1950s and 60s. And, if you had talked to a physician scientist in 1955, he would have said it's 10 years out. If you would have talked to somebody in 1965, it's 10 years out, right? Like we've been 10 years out from a male contraceptive pill for 60 or 70 years. And so it's, part of it is the kind of technological aspects of what does it mean to stop sperm production temporarily, and how do you then make sure that you can restart it if people don't want to be permanently sterilized. But it's also the case that, they've run various clinical trials over the years, and at any point there's sort of any side effects, then they do find sometimes men sort of throw up their hands and say, oh, I'm not interested in having any sort of risk of anything. Whereas, women who are taking a pill are taking on those kinds of risks every single day. So you get some of the snarky, like, oh, well, we can't have men having any side effects, but it's okay for women. So there's a whole lot that goes into the continuing absence of a male contraceptive pill. And for anybody who's listening who wants to really dive into that, there's an amazing book by a historian named Nellie Uchhorn called A Technology in the Making. The male pill. And it's still a technology in the making. We still don't have one. It's, July 7th, 2021.
I guess earlier when the female pill was first being developed, we were dealing with side effects in much higher rates than we are now, right? And so these things have been normalized. Rather than asking you about, how did we get here straight away, let me ask, in your research, have you spoken with men or done surveys and sort of ask the question, are men less interested in their health than women are, or what's the status there? Do you have a feeling?
Yeah, so it's a question that I can't really answer with nationally representative data, which is how I should be able to answer that question. But again, we pay less attention to men's health and men's reproductive health in particular. So there's, a lot of the national surveys on reproduction and family plans and reproductive plans either still do or until very recently only surveyed women. So there's not actually like really great data. I did for the purposes of writing this book, I did do interviews with about 40 men drawn from the general community about how they think about a man's role in reproduction, how they think about their own, bodily involvement, how they think about their genetic involvement, how they think about sperm and eggs, how they think about being a dad. So I have done qualitative interviews in which I did ask men sort of, what is it that you know about how men matter for reproduction? And, what if I told you that recent research reveals that a man's age and his bodily health and his health behaviors, smoking, drinking, drug use, and his toxic exposures, that all of these things prior to conception can actually damage sperm in such a way that it might affect the health of a man's children. And so in doing interviews with 40 people drawn from the general public, so men from all walks of life, more educated, less educated, men who were fathers, men who were not, in the United States, half of them were white, half of them were men of color, various, kind of international backgrounds. Most men had never heard this information, that their health prior to conception might affect the health of their children. And I was, heartened and, excited to see that they were actually quite interested in this information. They were like, why have I not heard this? They would say things like, I can't remember any doctor ever talking to me about any aspect of reproductive health. And a lot of them said the last time they heard anything at all about their own reproductive systems was a high school health class. Right. So this, again, it sort of goes back to this issue of, if you don't train physicians to think about men's reproductive health, and they only do studies on women, and they're not seeing men in the clinic anyway, and then, men are sitting in a high school health class, and literally, if that's literally the last time they hear anything about reproductive health, then there's a whole lot of opportunity there to increase the level of knowledge and the level of education, because I did find that men were absolutely interested in hearing it.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, so if you were going to look at solutions to the lack of information that men seem to have currently, would you want, in your perfect world, a system that sort of mirrors what women have, in the sense that, now you might have men going in for yearly checkups, not pap smears, but something else, and maybe warnings on beer cans that say if you drink too much of this, maybe your sperm quality won't be so good. Is that the sort of direction that you'd want to push in, or what are the limits to what you would be interested in?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good question, because one of the things that in writing the book, so I got to the conclusion of the book, and it was like, okay, well, now I've demonstrated the history of how we got here, and I've done my interviews with men about how they think about it. And then, okay, so now what? What do we do about it, right? Like, you could just remain in critique mode of, let's not continue to do it this way we've done it, but to actually think proactively about what next. And it's not an obvious answer to me. And the reason is because the history of how we have issued messages around women's reproductive health is not a great history. That's not really, I don't want to just take the sort of stress and anxiety that women feel about every bite they eat or every breath they take, and just spread that around to the entire population. I think we can actually sort of use the newness of men's reproductive health as a moment to take a step back and say, okay, well, what is the goal here? Which is to improve the health of individual bodies that might be in a position to be reproducing, so that children are healthier, right? So that's the goal. And if that's the goal, then the first step is to, increase the number of people who are aware that it's not just women and women's behaviors and women's bodies that affect reproductive outcomes, but also to include men and, frankly, people of all gender identities, not just men and not just women, in sort of thinking about the health of their own bodies. But at the same time, we also have to really take on a long-standing argument in both public health and medical sociology that health is not just a matter of individual choices and individual behaviors. I can't just sit here and say, all right, great, I'm going to be healthy now and move forward with that, right? We live in societies that are set up to either be more likely to help produce healthy bodies or not. And so I think making investments in, especially, I'm speaking to you from the United States, where we still don't have a true national healthcare system. We have just watched the pandemic ravage communities that have fewer economic resources and fewer educational resources and suffer from all kinds of structural inequalities. So in that kind of context, you can't just sit there and say, oh, well, if people just made better individual choices, they'll be healthier and their kids will be healthier. We also have to think about the structural contributions to health outcomes and environmental contributions to health outcomes. So I would not just sort of take what we've done with women, which is the labels on beer bottles and the kind of shaming, finger wagging approach. But I would sort of say, okay, for all people's reproductive health, let's think anew about how we might actually best get to a place where we can make it more possible for people to live healthier lives. Mm-hmm.
So talking about the structure that we're currently in, I should step back actually and ask you, what is the path that we took to get into the current structure, and sort of what is that structure more exactly?
Yeah, so I would say, kind of for me to sort of start the research project on, men's reproductive health and why is there not more attention to it, I felt the need to sort of get a sense of what had happened historically. And so I'm very fortunate at Yale that there's a very strong medical history program here. And I went and started hanging out with the historians because I knew how to do qualitative interviews with people where I could ask them about things like sperm, but I had never, gone to an archive, or I didn't even know like where to start in terms of thinking about how did we get to this place where, women's bodies are sort of perceived as reproductive and men's bodies are perceived as not reproductive. And so the medical historians here were very kind and spent a lot of very patient time with me. And essentially what I ended up doing was I ended up looking at the late 19th century, which is the moment where the medical profession became a profession. So in the US, the American Medical Association was founded in 1847, 1848. And within a couple decades, they start to specialize, right? So they say, oh, there's way too much knowledge out there. Not any one doctor can know it all. We have to focus, right? So you get early on, you get the ophthalmologists, the people who do the eyes were the first to break off and create a specialty because you really don't want to be messing around with the eyes unless you know what you're doing. But soon after you get obstetrics and GYN, gynecology, two of the earliest specialties that were really sort of about taking knowledge about women's reproductive bodies, hiving it off from the rest of medicine and considering it a specialized form of knowledge. And so those sort of early decades of medical specialization are when the medical profession began to take on the basic shape that it continues to hold to this day. And it's pretty fascinating, actually, if you look at medical specialization across countries. It doesn't quite play out in the same way in every place. So like if I were talking to you about medical specialization in Germany or in Italy or in, the US, these would all look slightly different. They kind of carve up the body in slightly different ways or understand the body in different ways, which is your number one signal. It's not just like biology telling us how to think about bodies. So anyway, so you get OB and GYN very early on. And there was this moment that I was sort of the first person to really write about in any detail, which is that there was an attempt to launch a parallel specialty for men's reproductive bodies, parallel to GYN, that was called Andrology. And this happens around 1890. It's a total failure. They get laughed out of the pages of medical journals. People are like, why would you consider starting a specialty for men's reproductive bodies? This is ridiculous. But the biggest part of the problem was that what the main men's reproductive health issue of the time was venereal disease. So syphilis was epidemic, gonorrhea was epidemic, there weren't good treatments. And so this, very elite group of doctors in New York City was trying to specialize in men's sexually transmitted diseases, which were associated with immorality and quackery and all kinds of things. And so it's a total failure. It fails to launch. And so I sort of argue that was, political scientists would call this a critical juncture. The lack of a male specialty for reproductive health very early on in the early days of medical professional specialization reverberates sort of all the way through the 19th century or in 20th century to the present day where, that work on contraceptive pills is an effect in part of OB and GYN being very established, very institutionalized. You have professional meetings, people can go and collaborate and make new knowledge, and then they build on it, right? So you've got the sort of looping effect of more and more attention to women and reproduction and women and reproduction, and a failure to attend to men and reproduction that sort of also, it's sort of a negative feedback loop as a way to think about it through the 20th century. I told you that was going to be a long answer because I'm like so excited about the history and like nobody had gone to go look at this moment. So that's why I always sort of signal like I can answer that, but it's going to be a long answer.
But a good answer. So let me ask you then a related question, actually, and this might also be a long answer. And I might stumble over my words here a little bit, but I'm curious how our cultural view of gender sort of wraps up into this story because, culturally, we're sort of a mix. You have sort of these traditional components to our views on gender. We also have, I guess, progressive and modern components. And so, on the one hand, just to give an example, there might be this traditionalist view where men's health and lives, in some restricted sense, are viewed as cheap. There's this courage and sacrifice, these values that are sort of tied up in traditional masculinity. But then on the other hand, we from the modern and progressive view, it might be confronting to talk about, men having issues, or because we view them as being in some place in some hierarchy, let's say. And so I guess my question is, does our cultural view of gender and all of its components in some sense create a situation where it's difficult for us to view men as vulnerable and being marginalized in even very specific ways like this? And so maybe there's some aspect there that's sort of tying down or preventing, what did you call it again? Andrology to explode into being?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so there's sort of a long tradition of research on gender and health, which I think is sort of helpful for thinking about, the question that you're posing, which is, what beliefs do we have about men and male bodies, more specifically, right? And so there's a long tradition of sort of, men being perceived and perceiving themselves as invulnerable. So this is where you get, the roots of things like only men could be soldiers, right? Like they're both gonna have the courage and the strength to go off and fight war, or coal miners or construction worker, right? You can sort of think about various occupations that have been stereotyped in terms of masculinity about being about sort of strength and invulnerability. And that absolutely plays out in the realm of health and medicine as well. In part, like I could give you an example from the world of infertility, where, for 100 and some years, there have been physicians who specialize in infertility. They mostly treat and think about what's wrong with women's bodies that this heterosexual couple can't kind of get pregnant and have a child. And so there's stories from, a century ago where you would have a physician do an entire workup and try all these treatments and do all these things on the woman, only at the very end of it to then go do a basic sperm count on the man. Right. And I can tell you a story from a week ago or 3 weeks ago. Almost every time I give any sort of talk about this research, somebody comes up to me and says, you know what? A woman who says, I went all the way through, X, Y, or Z fertility treatment, and they didn't even think to test my husband. And then they did, and he has no sperm. Right. So this kind of.
Which is horrible. That's really
horrible. Damaging
for her. That's horrible for her.
Right. Physically, economically, like these. So, but part of this is it illustrates the deep associations of our thinking about sort of where, when we're thinking about reproduction, we're almost always thinking in terms of women's bodies. And when we're thinking about men's bodies, most of the time, if I say men in reproduction, most of the time people are going to say sperm. Right. Mm-hmm. And then the questions about sperm, even when they are asked, are super narrow. So again, for 100 years, scientists and clinicians have known that sperm, it matters the number of sperm and can they swim and do they have a proper shape, right? So count, motility, and morphology in the technical version of that. But the sort of newer science of paternal effects is in the last couple decades saying, all right, it's not just about count or swimming or shape. It's also about the genetics inside the sperm. But for so long, the belief was, well, if a sperm can fertilize an egg, then it's got to be fine. Right. And so if you could get a doctor to actually do a sperm count, then at least they were doing the sperm count. But there's a whole other set of questions about sperm that we are just starting to scratch the surface of. And that's where, one of the things that I focus on in the book is sort of this newer emerging science of paternal effects that ties in with things like epigenetics. And so it's not just the strand of DNA, but what turns it on and off and environmental exposures. And this is all, extremely emergent, very unsettled. Like it's impossible to give anybody like, here's your individualized risk number. But what I'm saying in the book and what I'm saying as I sort of speak about this to various audiences is that at least we need to be asking the question. We need to be thinking about men's health as potentially significant and going to do some of the basic research so we have better information to give people.
It's sad that we have to think of it as potentially being significant. That's a very basic step to. So what's your view then on these recent reports that male sperm counts are dropping and the fertility is? Do you have like a view of where that research actually sits and what can be definitively said?
Yeah, so this is, one of these issues that when you look historically at sperm, you see that, every 5 or 10 years, there's some big new study, sperm counts are dropping, there's, headlines in the national newspapers, and everybody sort of scrambles. So the latest example of this happened in the last 6 months or so. There's a new book out, and it's basically based on a meta-analysis of data from multiple studies of sperm done over 40 or 50 years. And again, the headline is, both from the book and the actual headlines, that sperm count is dropping so rapidly that, humans might be running extinct by 2045. Like, it's ridiculous, right? So what I think, well, I will back up. And it's ridiculous to think that we are not going to be able to continue reproducing as a species. But it is absolutely the case that toxic chemicals in the environment have all kinds of health effects for all kinds of species, including humans. I have zero doubt that it is affecting sperm in some way. But the question again, and it's a really important, nitty gritty basic science sort of question, is, okay, well, how are the chemicals affecting sperm and in what way? Right? There's not a straightforward relationship between X number of chemicals, X effect on sperm, X effect on fertility, X effect on children's health. Each of those is, and I'm sure that there's a number of even more specific questions within each of those stages. But to move from, which some of the scientific literature does, a question of sperm counts to a conclusion about male fertility is a very simplistic step. And so that's what a lot of the people who sort of push back on that, every time these headlines appear, there's always less exciting stories, a couple of weeks later of like, well, the data don't really say that. It is much more complicated, but that doesn't generate the headlines in the same way. But it's very difficult, first of all, to know what an average sperm count was in 1950 or 1980 or 2020, because we don't have any population level surveillance programs testing men's sperm. So you're always relying on whatever samples exist, which tend to either be from sperm banks or fertility clinics, right? So sperm banks are recruiting super fertile men, and infertility clinics are potentially treating infertile men. And so there's always an effort to kind of calibrate. So there's no population level data to actually draw good conclusions from. And then the other thing about sperm that's so fascinating is it fluctuates, on a day-to-day basis. So my first book was actually on sperm banks and egg agencies. And one of the things that I learned that most people don't know is that, a man, like even a man who's been selected for highly, a sperm with very high sperm count, a 21-year-old guy who's in college and drinks a lot of beer the night before will go in and it totally decimates his sperm count. Or he's taking finals, or he sits down in a hot tub, right? So any of those things, sperm is constantly replenishing, but it takes about 2.5 months to grow in the body. So given that we've got these one point in time from biased samples over a number of decades, there's just not, it's hard to know for sure what's happening with sperm counts. But even if we knew what was happening with sperm counts, the relationship between sperm count and a man's ability to fertilize an egg is not a one-to-one relationship. So to have not great data and then not great an understanding of that relationship between sperm count and fertility, that's why you see so many people saying, okay, well, I'm not kind of running around waiting for the world to end, because the data just isn't great yet.
What about if you compare fertility clinics in, say, the 70s to fertility clinics now, where they had, did they have standardized procedures that lasted from then until now for selecting these ultra fertile men, or even that you can't do?
Well, most of the cases, the fertility clinics aren't going to be storing the sperm. So usually they're running a sperm count on a man's sample and then tossing it out. And so the other complication here, and it's so funny, you get into sperm and then you're like, okay, now I'm swimming around in a sea of sperm complexities. The other thing is that even the procedures for how you count how many sperm are in a sample have changed. And it's actually quite a science itself. And so if you have somebody who is, kind of a basic technician doing a quick count in 1972 for X man that's going to go into this sample of data, and they're not well trained or they don't do it often, then they're not going to get a very good count. And now there's machines that count, but sometimes they're not as good as clinicians who have been doing this for a really long time. So even the act of figuring out what is that number is not a super straightforward one.
Then I guess, I suppose now that this has been noticed as potentially a thing, I guess now over the coming years, we're going to be able to extrapolate better if this is actually a thing. But
yeah, well, they would have to actually start doing some sort of random sample of a population in order to generate what is an average sperm count over time, and then look at that in different places and times, because there's all kinds of in general, a man's sperm health is related to his bodily health. And if you have massive health inequalities in any given population, that's also going to affect whose sperm you want to test and to what end, right? Like what, again, thinking about like what's actually the goal here.
Mm-hmm. So just a very simple question. Do you know what percentage of infertility issues are due to the man?
So the general breakdown that you hear, again, and it's an estimate that I'm not sure how rooted in empirical data it is, but usually about a third of infertility cases are, they call them female factor, a third are male factor, and a third are unknown. So in a third of cases, you can go through all the testing and it's not clear why you're not getting pregnant, but it just, it's not working for whatever reason. But it's usually considered a third women, a third men, a third unknown.
Mm-hmm. Which makes me believe then it's probably 50-50, Yeah.
Probably.
If you do the same breakup on the unknown sample.
Yeah.
So what are the impacts of the man's health on? There's quality of sperm. So what are the impacts of the father's health on, miscarriages and the child's health, and maybe even, can bad sperm also have negative health impacts on the mother as she's carrying the child? Like, is research done along these lines or?
Yeah. So in one of the things that I did in the book was to really try to go look at what is the scientific evidence base for how men's own health and exposures can affect their children's health. And so I worked with a graduate student research assistant, and we basically did, not a formal meta-analysis, but we did a scientific literature review from about 1970 to 2015. And it turns out that some of the strongest evidence was really about paternal age. So as a man gets older, he's more likely, even though sperm is constantly being, generated, the sperm is more likely to have what are called de novo mutations or new mutations that arise. And those mutations appear to be associated with things like autism and schizophrenia in their offspring. So paternal age as a potential factor for men to consider in terms of their own sort of bodily health and the health of their children. Another really sort of strong evidence, a strong base of evidence was about paternal smoking. So for about 10 years, epidemiologists have been saying, men who smoke should be counseled to quit if they're thinking about conceiving a child, because there are germline mutations in the DNA that look to be associated with an increased risk of cancer for their children, right? So genetic change is happening in sperm that can affect a child's risk for cancer. So you've got paternal age, paternal smoking, and then I would say that there's sort of less clear evidence on paternal drinking. It's sort of different studies should either show it's a problem or not. And drug use, there hasn't been a whole lot of studies of drug use because it's illegal and you can't randomly, you can't run experiments on these things.
People will lie.
Yeah, right. And people lie. And then you've got things like BMI and diet and exercise, which are also very fuzzy. But there's a whole body of literature on environmental contaminants and the effects on sperm, both environmental contaminants in the workplace, in the home, so things like pesticides, paints with heavy metal, dentists who work with laughing gas. There's all kinds of individual studies. And environmental epidemiologists will say it's just very difficult to get really good data because it's hard to control for the person and the dose and the outcome. Because we're all constantly being exposed to all kinds of things. So how do you know that it's that one thing that caused this particular change in the sperm that led to this outcome for children? So there is good data from like mouse studies that environmental contaminants matter. But then again, you go from mice to men, and that brings its whole set of complexities with it in terms of thinking about how do you extrapolate and what levels of toxins are we concerned about? I can't remember your original question, but the answer is that there's a lot of different ways people have thought about how men's health matters for their children, and there's sort of places where the evidence is stronger than others. But in my view, the whole of the studies really sort of points to the need to do more research and to really kind of drill down on, all right, if paternal age is an issue or paternal smoking is an issue, why aren't we informing men of those risks?
I suppose one of the reasons why paternal age might also be a primary factor is that you're integrating all of these other problems over a longer period of time. So I want to ask about some other unrelated health issues that sort of men face. And one thing I was just curious to get your opinion on is has to do with sort of body issues and eating disorders, because we usually view these as being I suppose a women's issue or something that affects women more. But on the other hand, if we think about things a little bit differently, there are men who are taking supplements and going on eating regimes to grow their muscles large, or they're injecting themselves with all sorts of chemicals, or they're taking pills to grow back their hair or to grow other things on parts of their bodies. And so do we have some? Is there research that's comparable to what's done in the direction of women's body issues and eating disorders, which gives us some indication of how widespread these issues are for men? And then follow-up question, what the impact that might have on reproduction, for example?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. So I haven't ever done sort of a deep dive into the literature on men and eating disorders. But I think that the way that I would sort of approach that question is to think about, again, kind of the general understandings of masculinity in our culture and sort of the way that we think about what it means to be a man and definitions of manhood. And those are always just not only about gender, but also intersect with race and class and sexuality. So I say masculinity, but masculinity has built into it sort of these intersecting social processes around people's gender identity, their sexuality, their race, their class, et cetera. And you can think about masculinity, in terms of, as sort of to kind of follow along the lines of your question, you can think about how beliefs in masculinity and masculinity norms affect how individual men think about themselves and their bodies and what their bodies should look like and what they're willing to do to try to attain that norm, right? So you could sort of think about it on an individual level. You could think about it sort of on a more institutional level. How is the medical profession defined the male body and what a masculine body looks like? And what is a physician going to talk to his male patients about or not talk to them about? So masculinity plays a role in sort of physician and clinician training, but also in doctor-patient interactions. And then you've got the whole sort of world of cultural objects and, popular media and movies and books. And I'm just trying to think, the whole world of like YouTube and Instagram that I have like not ventured into, but I know it exists, but there's all kinds of sort of ways that masculinity floats around popular culture and shapes the portrayals of men's bodies. So yeah, I can't say off the top of my head what proportion of men sort of either, are regulating their eating in a way to try to attain that norm and or taking, see here's that and again, and or taking these like, supplements or drugs, engaging in sort of various chemical adjustments to their body. But absolutely, those, some of those medications and some of those, sort of approaches to managing one's body could affect your health and could affect sperm health as a result. And in fact, there has been some research in particular on steroids and the relationship between the use of steroids and later infertility. And I can't remember exactly what the risks were, but there was, there were people sort of looking into that possibility. And so that's where, sort of an interest in attaining some sort of masculine norm actually ends up, rendering men unable to have children. So these are not just, to say that these are social processes or cultural beliefs is not to say that they don't matter or don't have really significant consequences for people in their everyday lives.
And consequences that may come many years down the line. You may want to build muscle to attract women or whatever your goal is. Then in the end, you can't have children. And this is actually one of the entry points how I became sort of interested in this specific issue, because I know people who have fishing tackle boxes filled with pills, for every day of the week, and they go to the gym, and Monday is these three pills, and I asked them, where did you get them from? And they're all imported. They're all, God knows where they found out about them and what they're going to be doing ultimately to their bodies. It sort of scares me a little bit. But another question along these lines is, men, it's sort of accepted that men die younger. And so what I want to understand is there some sort of idea of whether this is, natural and unavoidable, or are there, problems structurally with the way that we treat men's health that sort of lead to less than perfect outcomes for men's longevity?
Both. I feel like this is like the sociology bumper sticker is like, it's complicated and it's all the things. So it's both of those and other things as well. So it's considered sort of, those of us who study sociology of health and medicine think about this as the gender paradox. So in general, gender inequality runs against women. But when it comes to longevity or the number of healthy days lived or healthy, years lived, women do better than men. So women live longer. There is some evidence that shows that women are more likely to have more disability days than men, but in part they think that's because men die younger. And men die younger because they don't go to the doctor when they're having some sort of condition. So they don't actually seek medical treatment. They are more likely to die younger because of accidents, including with things like firearms and suicide, workplace accidents. So it's when, you look at the longevity number, that both includes people sort of who die at 65 instead of 70, but also it factors in, people dying at 20 or 25 or 30, right? And so the idea that men die younger than women, comes back to, these issues of sort of thinking of men as invulnerable and not attending to some of the things that tend to make them sick and even kill them, such as, kind of the widespread and commonplace use of various supplements, right? Like this is, if people think of themselves as invulnerable and they don't have clinicians or public health campaigns saying, think about all the things that you're doing to your body on a daily basis and how those things might add up, right? Because it doesn't kind of compute that we need to be worried about men's health in these ways. Then I think that there's both that sort of inattention combined with sort of the parts of masculinity that are about sort of taking risks and, not seeking help when you need help and not ever sort of thinking about oneself as vulnerable and in need of whatever. So I think all of those things really do come together, potentially with some sort of biological mechanisms around, could be around hormones or just different kind of bodily processes that are happening in male bodies that aren't necessarily happening in female bodies or as often in female bodies. But I just want to put a footnote on the thing that I just said, which is that I would be very remiss if we get all the way through this conversation and not sort of say something about this terminology that I'm using of, men's reproductive health or women's reproductive health, as if men and women are two clearly defined,
species,
opposite categories, right? That we've got two sex categories and people fit neatly into one or the other. One of the things that I talk about in the book and that I've been doing a lot of thinking about more recently is, we have a cultural belief in sex as a binary, as, people are one or the other. And that is, it's just becoming increasingly important to think about and talk about and pay attention to all the ways that bodies don't fit into one of those two categories. And so here I'm thinking about people who are transgender, who maybe were assigned one of these categories at birth, but now identify as either a different category as non-binary, as not part of the gender binary. People who are born intersex. People whose sort of chromosomes and genitals, hormone levels, whatever, don't align with our neat and tidy understandings of male and female. So even as I say men's reproductive health or male bodies or biology of men, at every single one of these points, we also have to be aware of and pay attention to the fact that the binary itself has been constructed over very long periods of time, is entrenched in all kinds of ways of biological knowledge making, is entrenched even in our way of speaking, that I find it very difficult, even though I'm aware of it, to not go ahead and use those terms. So I just want to sort of mention that and, happy to talk in more detail about it. But I think, it's important to sort of both point out the inattention to men's reproductive health, but also question even that category of men at the same time.
Right. Do you think, so this is, okay, now again, this is completely outside of my area of expertise. With people who do research on gender, like rather than talking about a binary, does it make more sense to talk about sort of like a bimodal distribution, which is strongly bimodal, or like, because I don't know what the actual numbers are. Is that a more helpful way of viewing things, or would you say not?
I think this is just a wide open question right now. And I think really it comes down to what end, right? So if we're thinking about cultural definitions of women and men, like what makes a woman and what makes a man, part of that answer, if I were talking to an individual person asking about their own gender identity, you could find things on any sort of spectrum or off the spectrum or combination. So you get metaphors like gender fluidity or gender as a spectrum, or gender queer or non-binary, right? So some people sort of, instead of having two categories, they'll put male and female at two ends of a spectrum, and then they'll move along a line. And then there's people who just reject the line and reject the spectrum altogether, right? And so that's if we're sort of thinking about like gender, like individuals' identities and how they think of themselves and what masculinity is or what femininity is. And I'm very, as a scholar, sociologist of gender, that makes a lot of sense to me for when it comes to sort of individuals' understandings of their own selves and their own bodies. The question, which I think your question about sort of bimodal distribution is sort of more about like, is there any place we can go look in the body or in biology to actually find something that is, male and female sex? And, I think that certainly we all have material bodies, but they have been categorized in certain ways, and knowledge has been produced about them as male or female. So hormones are a great example, right? Testosterone, estrogen, in the early days of hormone research in the 1930s, the assumption was that they were going to go find the sort of essence of femininity in the ovaries, and they would pull out the ovaries and look at, and they thought they were going to find, and then they find estrogen. And a couple of years later, they find testosterone. But then they found that both men and women have both estrogen and testosterone. Right. And so then the hormone story is just vastly more complicated than women have estrogen and men have testosterone. But we still think of them as sex hormones, and we still associate, even though like everybody has both. Or most people have both, right? I'm not going to say everybody because it's almost always, you can't say 100% of the time. So hormones are far more complicated. Chromosomes are hugely complicated, right? So we think of the X as female and the Y as male, but people we have identified as men usually have an X and a Y, right? So how to think about that? And that's, for people who are interested in that, there's a historian at Harvard named Sarah Richardson who wrote a book called Sex Itself about how the X and the Y became the male and female chromosome. So that is a process that happened over time. So, I understand the impulse to say, all right, if we're looking at human bodies and we're going to kind of categorize them in various ways, there's been a longstanding effort to categorize people by race. And, whether we're talking about skull shape or in the genes, over the centuries, there have been so many attempts to go find race in the body with the hopes that it will be real, right? That it's really there somewhere. And those always fail. And I think we're at a kind of similar moment with sex and gender where, people have just assumed for so long that there are these two categories and then you go and make knowledge about them. So they seem very real. And people are sort of kind of taking a step back and starting to ask questions about okay, well, what is the biological basis, if any, for these two categories that we have? So I don't have a definitive answer for you, but that's in part because it is an open debate and an open question among scholars and scientists who are interested in these questions right now.
So bearing that in mind, just to use words that will get us through the conversation, I'm gonna still use the categories. Can I jump back? And I don't mean any insult to anyone by doing that, but can I jump back just a little bit, because you mentioned that. So when we're looking at the life expectancy of men, that's what I mean by use the. So if we were to factor out, for example, everyone underneath the age of 35. And then look at life expectancy of those populations. Does that gap close significantly? What's the story there then?
The gap between men and women?
Yeah.
That is a good question. I have not looked at the data in that way, but I would suspect. So my suspicion is that if a man is going to make it to 35, somebody who identifies as men, who has a body that we have historically identified as having male characteristics, if you have a man who's made it to 35 or 40 or 45, then they've probably moved out of the sort of youngest, riskiest taking kind of behaviors of being in their teens and 20s. It might be at that point that the biggest divergence is actually between people who are identified as white versus people of color, racial minorities. I'm just thinking of some of the data about life expectancy, especially in the United States, where we have, like I said, so many different inequalities operating. There's, life expectancy differences upwards of 10 or 15 or 20 years between whites and people of color. So it may be that once you get past 40, it's less about gender and more about race and sort of economic and educational resources. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head.
Because that's something I'm really interested in knowing. Now that I've gotten to a certain age, how does if I go to the doctor, and so on. But okay, so in terms of the impact in more broad terms, so we've spoken a little bit about the impact on individual people, but at the level of sort of government policy or research funding or clinical outcomes, what's the impact of this lack of attention to men's reproductive health and health in general?
Yeah, so this is, again, in the conclusion of the book, I sort of spend quite a lot of time kind of talking to a couple of different audiences. So one of them being biomedical researchers, to whom I say, please do more research about men's reproductive health and think about reproductive health, not just in terms of male bodies, but in terms of all bodies. And, how do we start to ask questions about reproductive outcomes that don't automatically assume sort of gender, don't automatically assume women, and don't automatically assume gender. Healthcare providers have an opportunity to be raising this issue of how men's health matters for their children's health with their patients, especially those who are thinking about having children. High school teachers could plop this into the high school curriculum so that if the last thing men ever hear about the reproductive system is in high school, they could at least hear that their health is not only affecting their lives, but potentially their children's lives. So those are all sort of educational kind of, in public health campaigns, right? The public health campaigns we have around reproductive health are all geared towards women. That could be expanded to think about the reproductive health of all bodies. So there's a real sort of push to think about kind of basic education, that this is a thing that exists and it matters. And I think potentially it has kind of ripple effects more broadly for reproductive politics and gender politics. So in the US, we have really, really sort of cantankerous, deeply conflictual, lots of efforts to try to control women's reproductive lives in various ways by state legislators, national legislators, various sorts of entities. And I think, if we can sort of tweak how we think about reproduction as not just being about women, my hope is that we could sort of kind of think in different ways about these reproductive politics as being not just women's business, not just women's responsibility, but in fact, involving relationships, including with men and with entire families and communities, and to think in sort of much more expansive and hopefully health-producing ways for the entire population, and not just sort of drop this at women's feet. So when I think really big, that's where I go in terms of thinking about how can we think about health differently for the entire population, and how can we sort of really kind of stop thinking about reproduction as something that is just happening inside women's bodies.
Mm-hmm. So is something happening now? Are things starting to change? Are people starting to take notice of these issues, or is this something that you're really banging your head against?
Well, it's hard for me to tell. I think in part because, in a normal time, when you publish a book, you go out and you give talks and you interact with people and you sit over dinner and you say, okay, so it's hard to tell, from my little corner of the world where I'm certainly sitting here saying like sperm matters and men's health matters. And I've also been writing about sperm for a really long time. So there's moments that I get sort of, kind of optimistic that at least people are sort of starting to think and talk about this. There's more scientists, frankly, who are doing research now than even 10 years ago on these issues. I'll hear little things about there's an NIH panel grouping on this, or there's going to be a call for proposals on this, or I've been talking with a couple of different nonprofits who focus on male contraception or whatever. So it seems like there's, maybe a little bit of traction, but also in those conversations, I hear from those people who also care about this that it's hard for them to get their colleagues to listen, or it's hard to find funding. So I think, this is definitely, not over by any means. It's one of those things that if I can do a little bit of work to sort of call a little bit more attention to it, I will have felt like that will be a success. But I don't have any illusions that I'm going to, wave a wand and tomorrow we will all suddenly care and think about reproductive health in very different ways. But that's probably the story of all kinds of progress in terms of making new knowledge, whether it's physics or sociology or health and medicine, that, we're all sort of kind of working incrementally to try to make things a little bit better, and hopefully not to make them any worse, but to try to figure out what it is that we can say from the place where we are able to speak.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask a couple of questions that are a bit more controversial, but before doing that, I might leave them till the very end. Okay. But before doing that, let me ask you something that's a little bit out of left field.
Well, I probably have 5 more minutes, so we should also.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Then let me just ask you something a bit out of left field. Okay. Then. So when the female pill came online, let's say, it gave women, freedom and control over their reproduction, right? It gave them control of their sexuality in new and interesting ways that had never been the case before in human history, I suppose. And so what I am curious about, let's imagine that tomorrow a male pill comes in. What are the impacts what do you think the impacts will be on, men's participation in pregnancy in society, gender roles generally, fatherhood, the politics of sex? So, for example, how cheap does sperm become, or how expensive does it become if all the men are now on the contraceptive pill? And these questions of supply and demand. So this is a big question, and hopefully you can wrap it up in 5 minutes. But yeah,
it's a really interesting question. So because I did not focus in on male contraception in this book, although interestingly, the book is leading me to have many conversations about male contraception, and so now I've been reading more about it. But I don't have a great answer to your. I completely agree with you that it's interesting to sort of think about what the follow-on effects might be. But I don't have a great question because I haven't done the deep dive into there are some interview studies with men about, would they be interested in taking a male pill if it existed, and how would it change what they're thinking about? But, so I'll answer it by taking a step back and saying, for people in sociology and history who study technology, there is almost always a tendency to sort of focus on technological change as the specific thing that is going to matter. But anytime you get any sort of technological change, it's nested within all kinds of pre-existing social processes around gender and the healthcare system and norms of masculinity and whatever. Do I think that if there was a male contraceptive pill available tomorrow, that it would potentially shift all kinds of things? Probably, but I don't think that it would necessarily revolutionize all the other stuff, the healthcare stuff and the masculinity norms and, the gender politics. So I guess that's, a little bit of a cop out, but that's the way I would begin to think about that question, if not an actual answer.
I mean, because there's been a huge impact for also sanitation technology. There are these technologies that really came in and revolutionized things for women. This is one thing that I can imagine might have a revolutionary effect for men. I can't think of too many other technologies that might come in that are like that. But yeah, may I ask just one other quick question about, so just generally speaking, so this is a little bit more controversial, but so do you think there are aspects of gender discourse that are just going to necessarily bump heads? So to give an example, a large part of the abortion debate, for example, is my body, my choice. And so a large part of the discussion that we've been having has been, what's our view of how men contribute to fatherhood or to parenthood, and are there aspects of this discourse that may be very useful in some ways, but we may actually have to think about being a bit more careful with as we move forward and we develop empathy for in different ways for different elements of the population, however you want to describe the distribution of how people lie on the gender and sex line or landscape. I suppose that's the question. Is it inevitable that we're going to bump heads as we start thinking more solidly about different aspects of our population?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I don't find it to be controversial. And maybe I'm not totally getting your meaning if I'm not thinking it's controversial, but
well, I'm trying to step as lightly as possible because
yes. Well, so again, a little bit of sort of historical context here is that the reproductive rights movement in the 1970s really did use this language of choice and individual rights. And it was primarily a white women's movement about access to contraception and abortion. And I would say in the last 2 decades, there's been a real shift in what would have been the reproductive rights movement to sort of a discourse around moving from choice to justice. So thinking about reproductive justice instead of reproductive choice. And part of that shift in language, which is being sort of pushed by women of color organizations like Sister Song, is to really say, you know, this isn't just all about individual choices and individual decisions. And we need to not only be thinking about contraception and abortion, but thinking about access to all kinds of reproductive health care. So I think that reproductive justice model and framework is entirely compatible with thinking about men's reproductive health. And, you know, and what does reproductive justice look like for men? And it could be that, you know, for men to have knowledge and information and access to resources to make decisions about their own contraception and their own reproductive lives. But I don't think, you know, I think the sort of battle of the sexes model where like every gain for men is a loss for women and vice versa. You know, I think we just live in a much more related, you know, compatible world than that. And I see actually focus, you know, I'm a feminist sociologist who has just spent 20 years talking about sperm. Like, that's not where I expected to go with my career. But it makes a lot of sense to me to think about how men's lives have been just as shaped and influenced and constrained by gender politics as women's lives have, and calling attention to that and thinking through that. And what is it that we know and don't know about men because of how we understand men and women to be related categories. So I don't anticipate it being, I mean, there are certainly people who could take it in that direction, right? Like there's already people who would like to control women's reproductive bodies, right? So those people are going to continue to make that argument, but I don't think it's necessarily correlated to an increased focus on men's reproductive health. I think you can think about that in very expansive, you know, non-individual choice-based ways that really does open up a broader conception and brings us back to that issue of, you know, the public health and not just individual health.
Escaped Sapiens.